In what ways did Air Force trauma alter Jimmy Stewart's career? The Oscar in the hardware store. In 1941, in the small town of Indiana, Pennsylvania, inside a modest hardware store that sold hammers and nails and coils of rope, there sat an object that had no business being there. Locked behind a glass display case, surrounded by tools and bolts and the ordinary things of everyday life, was a gold Academy Award statuette, one of the most coveted prizes in the world of American entertainment. The store's owner had placed it there because his son sent it home, and that statuette would remain in that hardware store display case for the next 25 years. Think about that for a moment. While the rest of Hollywood polished their Oscars and placed them on mantelpieces in Beverly Hills mansions, Jimmy Stewart packed his up and mailed it back to his father in Pennsylvania. Not as a loan, not temporarily. He sent it home because he felt that was where it truly belonged. That single act tells you more about the man than any biography ever written about him. But the man who sent that Oscar home was not in Hollywood when his father placed it in the display case. He was not at a studio lot, reading scripts or attending industry parties. He was in the skies over Europe, piloting a B-24 Liberator bomber through walls of anti-aircraft fire, leading missions from which some of his men would never return. This is the story of Jimmy Stewart, not the version you already know. This is the story of what happened between the man who won that Oscar and the man who came home from the war. Because something changed in those years he spent at 30,000 feet above Germany and France. Something changed so completely, so permanently, that it reshaped every role he chose, every scene he performed, and every way he understood what his work was actually for. Today, we are going to look at exactly how that happened, and exactly what it cost him, and what it ultimately gave him. By the time this story is over, you will never watch It's a Wonderful Life the same way again. You will understand why Alfred Hitchcock said Jimmy Stewart was the only actor he ever worked with who didn't need to be taught what obsession felt like. And you will hear about the moment a Hollywood legend sat in front of a national television audience, read a poem about his dog, and could barely get through it, and why that moment captured something that all his greatest films never quite could.
You've made me ashamed of every concept I ever had of superior or inferior beings. But
The man before the war. James Maitland Stewart was born on May 20th, 1908 in Indiana, Pennsylvania, a quiet town that most Americans would pass through without stopping. His father, Alexander Stewart, ran the family hardware store, a business passed down through generations. It was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where a handshake meant something, and where the measure of a man was how he treated the person standing in front of him. Jimmy grew up behind that counter. He watched his father deal with customers honestly, give credit when times were hard, and never once put on airs. The lessons Alexander Stewart taught his son were not lessons about acting or ambition. They were lessons about character, about keeping your word, doing your duty, and never confusing what you had accomplished with who you actually were. Those lessons from a small-town hardware store would follow Jimmy Stewart through every chapter of his life, through Hollywood, through the war, through the long years afterward when he carried things he could never put into words. You cannot understand what the war did to Jimmy Stewart without first understanding the foundation it worked on. A foundation built not in film school or on a Broadway stage, but behind a counter in western Pennsylvania. Stewart attended Princeton University, his father's alma mater, and graduated in 1932 with a degree in architecture. He was a serious student, a member of the university's drama club, and a skilled accordion player who could hold a room with music the same way he would later hold it with silence on screen. He graduated into the teeth of the Great Depression. Architecture work was nearly impossible to find. Through a connection with his Princeton theater group, He joined a small acting company in Falmouth, Massachusetts. He roomed with another young actor named Henry Fonda. Neither of them had much money. Both of them had ambition. And one of them, in the years ahead, would make a decision that would change everything. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the improbability of Jimmy Stewart's early career. This was not a man born with the easy confidence of a leading man. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, barely over 130 pounds, with a slow and halting way of speaking that made studio executives nervous. MGM signed him, and then spent months trying to figure out what to do with him. The truth was, the thing they thought was his weakness, that unhurried, thoughtful delivery, that sense that every word cost him something, was precisely what made audiences trust him completely. By the late 1930s, Stewart had become one of the most popular actors in Hollywood. His role as the idealistic young Senator Jefferson Smith in Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939 made him a national figure, the embodiment of American decency and moral courage in the face of corruption. The performance earned him his first Academy Award nomination. The following year, he won the Oscar itself. For his performance as the charming Macaulay Connor in The Philadelphia Story, Jimmy Stewart took home the Academy Award for Best Actor on February 27, 1941. He was 32 years old. He was at the top of his profession. He had every reason to believe the best years of his career were directly ahead of him. Instead, he packed up the Oscar and sent it home to his father. That gesture, quiet, unannounced, with no press release attached, defined the man more completely than any role he ever played. In an industry built on self-promotion, Jimmy Stewart's first instinct upon receiving its highest honor was to give it to the person who had given him his values. The statuette would sit in Alexander Stewart's hardware store display case for 25 years, not as a trophy, as a reminder of where the son came from and what the father had built. In 1941, Jimmy Stewart was at a place in his career that most actors spend their entire lives trying to reach. The Oscar was his. The scripts were lined up. The offers were extraordinary. What he chose to do next was not rational by any professional calculation, but for Jimmy Stewart, the calculation was never professional. It was personal. And it was the kind of personal that no amount of Hollywood success could compete with. The war, the origin of everything that changed. When the United States began preparing to enter World War II, Jimmy Stewart went to his local draft board and registered for service. He was turned away. The reason was almost absurd, given the enormity of what was at stake. Stewart weighed 138 pounds, exactly 5 pounds below the minimum enlistment weight. He went home. And in the weeks that followed, one of the most famous men in America sat down and ate ice cream and chocolate bars every single day, trying to gain 5 pounds so that he could go to war. He returned to the draft board. He made weight. He was accepted into the Army Air Corps. Take a moment with that image. An Oscar-winning actor, eating ice cream alone, not because he wanted to, but because he wanted to serve badly enough to do whatever it took. He was not thinking about his image. He was not calculating what military service would do for his public profile. He was thinking about what he believed was right. That is the person who went to war in 1943. When the Army realized they had one of Hollywood's biggest stars in uniform, they had plans for him, plans that would keep him safe and still make use of his fame. He would make recruitment films. He would appear at public events. He would inspire enlistment without ever setting foot in a combat aircraft. Jimmy Stewart refused, flatly. He told his commanding officers that he had not enlisted to make movies. He had enlisted to fight, the same as any other man in uniform. He requested a combat assignment. He was turned down. He requested again. He continued requesting until, in November of 1943, he was finally sent to England. assigned to the 445th Bomb Group and given command of the 703rd Bomb Squadron. This is the detail that separates Jimmy Stewart's military service from the well-publicized wartime appearances of many celebrities of his era. He did not want the comfortable version. He specifically, repeatedly, and on the record, rejected the safe version. He wanted to be treated exactly as every other airman was treated, with all the danger that entailed. There were no cameras there for that decision. It was simply who he was. Between late 1943 and the end of the war in 1945, Jimmy Stewart flew more than 20 combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. He piloted his B-24 through some of the most heavily defended airspace of the entire war, through curtains of German anti-aircraft fire, through fighter attacks, through weather that could kill you as efficiently as any enemy weapon. His service earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters and several other military decorations, making him the most decorated actor to serve in the conflict. The number 20 does not sound large until you understand what each of those missions actually meant. Each takeoff was a genuine calculation of survival odds. Each mission into the skies over Germany was a confrontation with the real possibility that you would not come back. And it was not the number of missions he flew that would stay with Jimmy Stewart for the rest of his life. It was what happened on one specific day that he never, in any interview, any conversation, any recorded private moment, ever spoke about directly. At some point during his combat service, the bomb group under Stewart's command struck the wrong target. Not a military installation, not a weapons depot, a civilian area, in a city that was not the city in their orders. The historical records of that day are incomplete. What is documented is the outcome, and what is known from the men who flew beside him is this. From that day forward, something in Jimmy Stewart's eyes was different, and it never came back. He never spoke about it, not once. Over the course of 15 months of combat, Jimmy Stewart lost 13 air crews, 130 men. These were not names on a list to him. He knew these men personally. He knew what they ordered when they went to the mess hall. He knew the names of their wives and their children back home. He knew the jokes they told to push the fear back before a mission. And he was the one who gave the orders that sent them into the sky. He was the one who came back. After the war, when journalists asked him about the heroes he had known, his answers were always short to the point of seeming rude. He would say something like, "The real heroes didn't come home to answer that question." He was not being modest, he was being precise. With 130 men who did not return, Jimmy Stewart felt he had no standing to accept the word hero. That feeling never left him. The pilots who flew with him during the war described what they called flak happy, the term their generation used for the condition we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Stewart returned from Europe in the summer of 1945 at 37 years old, with gray already threading through his hair. He could not sleep soundly. Sudden loud sounds made him flinch. The images he carried from the skies over Germany and France did not dim. They stayed with him, sharp and present, long after the guns had gone quiet. Hollywood had not changed. The parties were the same. The lights were the same. The people he had known before the war smiled and asked what he was going to do next. And Jimmy Stewart looked at all of it through something like glass. Physically present, but unable to fully connect with a world that had not been where he had been. This is the man who came home. This is the origin of every change that followed. And the first change, the most visible, the most documented, and the one that shocked the people who knew his work, happened on the very first film set he walked onto after the war ended. The first way, trauma changed how he acted. Frank Capra gave Jimmy Stewart the script for It's a Wonderful Life not long after Stewart returned from Europe. Capra had served in the war himself. He understood, at least partially, what the men coming home were carrying. He believed the story of George Bailey, a man who had given up every dream he ever had in service of everyone around him, and who reached a night of complete despair, was exactly the right story for Jimmy Stewart to tell. Stewart read the script. He closed it, and he told Capra he wasn't sure he still wanted to act. "I don't know if I'm still an actor," he said. "I don't know who I am anymore." This was not a negotiating tactic. This was not humility performed for effect. This was a man who had spent 4.5 years in a world where the stakes were life and death, and who genuinely could not see the path back to standing in front of a camera and pretending. Capra persisted, and Stewart eventually agreed. What happened on the set of It's a Wonderful Life is something that no director could have planned, no acting coach could have taught, and no script could have called for. George Bailey is a man who has spent his entire adult life sacrificing his own ambitions for the good of everyone around him, and who arrives at a single winter night feeling that he has failed completely, that his life has been worthless, that the world would be better off without him. He stands on a bridge in the snow and considers whether to jump. Jimmy Stewart did not need anyone to explain to him what a man feels when he stands in that place. He had been in the vicinity of that feeling himself. He had carried the weight of 130 dead men. He had made decisions he could never take back. He had come home to a life that no longer felt entirely like his own. There is a scene in the film where George Bailey sits in a bar, lowers his head into his hands, and prays for the first time in his life. Not a composed Sunday morning prayer, a raw and desperate appeal from a man who has run out of everything else. The people on set that day said they watched genuine tears run down Jimmy Stewart's face during the filming of that scene. Frank Capra did not call cut. He let the camera run. Nobody on the set said a word when it was over. That was not acting. That was a man doing something real inside the frame of a fictional story. He was praying with another man's words, but with his own grief, with the weight of the wrong city, with the faces of the 130 men he had sent into the sky. There is another scene in the film that has become one of the most analyzed pieces of acting of the 1940s. George Bailey comes home to his family after the worst day of his life and loses control completely. He shouts at his wife. He shouts at his children. He picks up things and puts them down. He stands in the middle of his own living room, shaking, not understanding why he is doing any of this. And then the shame comes. Visible, physical, devastating. Critics called it the most truthful screen performance of the decade. Stewart didn't construct that scene from technique. The sudden eruption without warning, followed by confusion and shame. That is a precise clinical description of a PTSD episode. He was not performing something he had studied. He was containing something he lived with every day. And for those few minutes on a film set in 1946, he allowed it to come through. It's a Wonderful Life was a commercial failure when it was released. It would take decades for the film to become the Christmas tradition that America now treats as sacred. But something happened, immediately and quietly, in Jimmy Stewart. He understood that he was still capable of doing something true with his work. That what he had been through had not taken acting away from him. It had given him access to something he could never have reached before. A depth of authentic feeling that no performance training could manufacture. Frank Capra said later that the film contained the finest acting he had ever witnessed in his career as a director. And he said that he could not take credit for it. He said he had simply kept the camera running. The second way. Trauma changed what roles he chose. When Stewart returned to Hollywood after the war, the studios had a straightforward idea of what to do with him. They wanted to put him back into the roles that had made him famous. The naive idealist, the honest everyman who believed in the system. Jefferson Smith, fighting for justice in the Senate. Characters built on an unshakable belief that goodness, if pursued with enough sincerity, would prevail. Stewart could not do it anymore. Not because he had lost his skill, not because the roles were beneath him, but because he had lived through things that made it impossible to honestly portray a man who believed the world worked that way. He had seen what happened when orders were followed correctly and civilians died anyway. He had watched good men do everything right and still not come home. He could not stand in front of a camera and embody a faith he no longer held in the same unquestioning way. He turned down scripts. He waited. And then a director named Anthony Mann came to him with something different. Mann offered Stewart the role of Lynn McAdam in Winchester 73, released in 1950. Lynn McAdam is not a good man in the conventional sense. He is a man consumed by the need for revenge, cold and single-minded, capable of a kind of focused ruthlessness that would have been entirely foreign to Jefferson Smith. He carries something dark inside him that he cannot set down, even when it costs him everything. Stewart took the role without hesitation. Mann described his experience of working with Stewart in an interview years later. He said, "When I looked into Jimmy's eyes, I could see something in there that he never talked about. I didn't need him to perform intensity. I just needed to point the camera and give him the space to stop holding it back." What Mann recognized, and what he built an entire series of films around, was that the war had left something in Jimmy Stewart that was genuinely there, not as a performance choice, but as a fact of his inner life. The controlled rage, the sense of carrying something unresolvable, the specific look of a man who has seen things he cannot undo and has learned to keep moving anyway. Mann used it with precision across 8 films together, including 6 westerns, and some of the finest work of Stewart's entire career. What the studios thought was a problem, that Stewart could no longer play uncomplicated innocence, turned out to be the beginning of his most critically admired period. Then came Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock cast Stewart in 4 films: Rope in 1948, Rear Window in 1954, The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1956, and Vertigo in 1958. All 4 became classics. Rear Window and Vertigo are regularly cited among the greatest films ever made in the history of American cinema. Hitchcock said something about Stewart in an interview that has been quoted and analyzed for decades since. He said, "Stewart is the only actor I ever worked with whom I never had to explain what obsession felt like. He already knew." That sentence is not a compliment about acting ability. It is a statement about lived experience. Hitchcock was not extracting technique from Jimmy Stewart. He was excavating something real. In Vertigo, Stewart plays Scotty Ferguson, a man imprisoned by memory, unable to release a woman who is already gone, driven by an obsession he knows is destroying him, and unable to stop it anyway. It is one of the most psychologically complex roles in American film history, and it requires the actor playing it to inhabit a specific kind of trapped suffering that most people never experience. Stewart inhabited it completely, because it was not entirely unfamiliar. In Rear Window, Stewart plays a man confined to a wheelchair in a single apartment, able only to look out his window at the world outside, watching life unfold without being able to participate in it, seeing things happen that he cannot stop. It is, whether Hitchcock intended it or not, a near-perfect metaphor for what survivors of trauma often describe: the feeling of being physically present in the world while something invisible keeps you separated from it. The actors Stewart's generation is compared to, Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, were extraordinary in their own ways. But none of them had the second act that Stewart had. None of them made the films he made with Mann and Hitchcock in the 1950s. And the reason, more than any other, is that none of them came home from the war carrying what Jimmy Stewart carried: The trauma did not limit his career. It expanded it into territory that no other actor of his era was capable of reaching. The third way. Trauma changed how he understood fame. After the war, several film studios approached Jimmy Stewart about making a movie based on his military service. The story was ready-made. An Oscar-winning Hollywood star gives up everything to serve his country, flies 20 combat missions over Nazi Germany, earns the Distinguished Flying Cross, and comes home a hero. It was exactly the kind of film that studios knew how to make and audiences paid to see. Stewart refused every approach, every single one. For the rest of his life, he never permitted any dramatization of his wartime service. He never gave an interview in which he described his combat missions in detail. He never allowed Hollywood to make him into the hero of his own war story. He never explained this refusal publicly in full. But the reason is not difficult to understand if you know the man. The people who deserved to be honored for what happened in those skies over Europe were the people who did not come home to be asked about it. Making a film that centered on his own survival, with 130 of his men in unmarked graves, was something Jimmy Stewart could simply not reconcile with his conscience. It was not a publicity strategy. It was loyalty to the dead. When journalists persisted and asked him about the heroes he had known in the war, his answers were always some version of the same thing. He would say that the real heroes didn't come home. He would say it quietly, without drama, and then he would change the subject. In 1949, at 41 years old, Jimmy Stewart married Gloria McLean. She was a divorced woman with 2 young children from her previous marriage. By every conventional Hollywood standard of the era, this was a complicated situation. Stewart did not find it complicated. He adopted both of Gloria's children as his own. They would go on to have 2 more children together. They were married for 45 years. There was never a scandal, never a credible rumor, never a source close to the couple who told a reporter that things were falling apart. In a city where marriages routinely lasted less time than film productions, Jimmy and Gloria Stewart lasted 45 years. The man who had watched 130 men die was never going to confuse the things that actually mattered with the things that only appeared to matter. That clarity, hard-bought, permanently installed, extended to every corner of his private life. In 1969, Stewart's son, Ronald, was killed in Vietnam. Ronald was his adopted son, the eldest child he had taken as his own when he married Gloria. When the news came, Stewart did not call a press conference. He did not issue a lengthy statement. He did not use his son's death as a platform for any political position on the war. He said, in a short interview sometime afterward, 9 words: "I am proud of the way my son served his country." Those who have lost a child understand what it takes to say 9 words when what you actually feel is unsurvivable. Jimmy Stewart had learned, in the skies over Europe, how to carry loss and keep standing. He had been practicing for 25 years. It did not make Ronald's death easier. It simply meant he had more experience than most people alive in the art of continuing to move when you believe you cannot. Then there was the night of the poem. In 1981, Jimmy Stewart appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He was 73 years old. The studio audience expected what they always got from Hollywood legends on late-night television: stories from the set, memories of famous co-stars, the polished anecdotes that actors accumulate over decades of being asked the same questions. Instead, Stewart reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He told Johnny Carson that he wanted to read something, that he had written a poem about his dog, that the dog's name was Bo, that Bo had just died. Carson, a man who had conducted thousands of interviews and almost never lost his composure on camera, sat quietly. Stewart began to read. His voice, already famous for its slow and halting quality, broke in ways that had nothing to do with his natural delivery. He was fighting to get through the words. He was not performing grief. He was in the middle of it, in front of the entire country, with a piece of paper shaking slightly in his hands. He finished the poem. The studio audience was completely silent for a moment. Then they applauded. Not the polite, scheduled applause of a television broadcast, but the kind of applause that people give when they do not know what else to do with what they are feeling. Here is what made that moment matter beyond the loss of a pet. This was a man who had carried the weight of 130 dead men without ever crying on camera. A man who had lost his son to a war and said 9 words. A man who had spent decades keeping the worst things he had experienced locked somewhere that reporters could not reach. And in 1981, on a late-night talk show, Jimmy Stewart finally came undone. Not over the war, not over Ronald, not over any of the vast and unspoken griefs of his life, but over a dog named Bo. Because Bo was safe to grieve. Bo was the door that opened onto everything else, and the country understood. Not consciously, perhaps, but they understood. What the trauma made? There is a question that occasionally gets raised when people discuss the trajectory of Jimmy Stewart's career. The question is, would he have become a greater actor if he had never gone to war? The question misunderstands the situation entirely. Jimmy Stewart, before the war, was an excellent actor. He had craft, charm, and a quality of authentic presence that very few performers ever achieve. Jefferson Smith and George Bailey, from the pre-war script readings, those performances were real, and they were good. But they were the work of a man who had not yet been broken open. Jimmy Stewart, after the war, was something different. He was not a better technician. He was not more skilled in the conventional sense. He was simply more true. He had access to registers of human experience, despair, obsession, guilt, the specific weight of responsibility for other people's lives that you cannot reach from the outside. You can only reach them by having lived somewhere near them. That is what Frank Capra's camera found when it kept running during the prayer scene. That is what Anthony Mann saw in his eyes before a single word of the script had been spoken. That is what Hitchcock meant when he said he never had to explain obsession. That is what the audience at The Tonight Show felt when a 73-year-old man read a poem about his dog and could barely finish it. None of those moments were acting. All of them were true, and all of them traced back to the skies over Europe, to the wrong city, to the 130 names he carried without ever speaking them aloud. In the last years of his life, after Gloria's death in 1994, Jimmy Stewart rarely left the house. Friends who visited would find him sitting in a chair he had always favored, looking out at the garden where he and Gloria used to drink their morning coffee. He had everything he had ever built, the career, the legacy, the decades of work that had earned him an honorary Oscar and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. None of it, in those final years, seems to interest him much. What he was waiting for was simpler than any of that. On July 2, 1997, Jimmy Stewart died at his home in Los Angeles. He was 89 years old. His family was with him. Before he died, he said to the people in the room, "I'm going to be with Gloria again." Nothing else. The man who had been afraid not of bombs or bullets, but of giving a wrong order that cost someone their life. The man who had eaten ice cream to earn the right to go to war, who had refused to let Hollywood make a hero of him, who had sent his Oscar to a hardware store in Pennsylvania and left it there for 25 years. That man went out quietly, with the people he loved nearby, saying the only thing that, in the end, actually mattered to him. Not about the films, not about the awards, not about the legacy that critics and scholars would spend decades analyzing. about Gloria. That is who Jimmy Stewart was, not despite the war, not in spite of what it cost him, but because of the kind of man who goes through what he went through and comes out the other side still knowing what matters, still keeping his word, still choosing the real thing over the celebrated version of it. Every role he played after 1945 was shaped by what he could never say. Every scene that still moves audiences today contains, somewhere inside it, something that was never in the script. It was just there, in the posture, in the silence, in the specific quality of pain that only comes from having actually been somewhere near it. That is what Air Force trauma did to Jimmy Stewart's career. It made it true. The real heroes didn't come home to answer that question. James Maitland Stewart, 1908 to 1997.